Good morning, everybody. It is 10 a.m. on April 1st, and we are ready to start our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We know that you probably have been watching more webinars now than ever with everybody going virtual and also trying to manage all of this information that employers are having to work through. So I'm Suzi with Xenium, and I will be your moderator today. And then I have Luke Reese from GHR, Garret, Hemman, Robertson, here with me to help provide you with some information and answer some of your questions. A couple quick housekeeping items. This is a 1-hour presentation. We are leaving some time for some Q&A. I want to invite you to insert your questions into the chat window, and I will be watching those as we go along. If we don't have time to answer your questions, we know there are many. Just know that we are looking to schedule some more webinars in the form of some panel discussions and just focus on answering questions. And so know that there'll be more resources in the near future for you. You will get a copy of the slides and the recording of this webinar as well. And if you want any other information, resources, updates on events that Xenium or GHR is sponsoring, please reach out to us or subscribe at xeniumhr.com. So with that, I will introduce our presenter here. Luke Reese is an employment attorney and partner with Garret, Hemman, Robertson in Salem. And Xenium has been working with him very closely. In fact, we've been on the phone with him daily for at least the last couple weeks. And he is just a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and also is really good at strategizing how to approach all of these various scenarios and questions about what to do in our situation. So I'm glad to have him with us. He will be delivering a majority of the content, and he has some good stuff planned for you. We did take into consideration the questions that were provided when you registered for this webinar. Okay, so with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Luke.
Thank you, Suzi. So what we'd like to do today is what we envision to be the first of a multi-part series of essentially using the collective knowledge of all the HR professionals who we have in our group here and have signed up for the webinar to navigate all of the issues that are going to be thrown at us in the HR world because of this historic pandemic situation. It really can't be overstated how significant this event is going to be in history, and everyone is going to have to do their part to help us manage these kind of unprecedented waters as a community. Those of us who live in the HR world, frankly, have a very important role in all that. It's going to be up to us to carry out all of the legislation that the government has put in place to help out both companies and employees because of all these challenges. It's going to be up to us to do that in the most short emergency sort of way. The laws that we're going to be talking about today weren't even a conceived possibility a month ago. This is unheard of to have significant leave and other employment laws get fast-tracked through the legislative process and put into place in a way that doesn't allow for all of the learning and all of the working out of the kinks that we're used to seeing. Beyond just understanding these laws and figuring out how they apply to our workers, we also have to navigate the challenges that are presented because of the health concerns related to all this. Never before have we all been forced to work to telecommute, if at all possible. There's a lot of us who have never done that before, and now we're not only having to get used to ourselves working remotely, but managing our entire staff and all of our offices in a way that just has never been done before. That's going to present a whole other set of unique challenges that I think will be good for us to follow up on as a group to work through not only what we know to be the best practices now, but what we learn to be the best practices as we all try things out and see what works and what doesn't work. Also, what I would envision being included in these ongoing conversations is discussions about the loans that are going to be available to many of the organizations where we work from the federal government. The Small Business Loan Program was passed by the federal government last week and is currently being rolled out very quickly as well. There is going to be a tremendous amount of money that is available to especially small businesses. There's going to be requirements put on that we'll need to be mindful of, but in many circumstances, that money is going to be available to help us keep our employees employed or to get them reemployed as soon as possible. We're not going to focus on the specifics of the CARES program or the loan process today, but please do write any questions that you have along those lines, so when we're preparing for these panel presentations that we're discussing down the road, we can make sure that we have the right people on board to answer the questions that are at the top of your mind. All right, so for today, we are going to start by talking about the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which has added to the family leave protections and created a whole new category of 2 weeks of paid sick leave. Both of those statutes go into effect today, April 1st, and are going to remain in effect through the end of the year. So it's going to be important that everybody who has any kind of HR responsibility at their organization understands what those laws are and is ready to roll them out immediately. As soon as this presentation's done, we're going to email out a fact sheet that has the nuts and bolts basics of both laws. We're also going to email out a sample policy that I'd encourage everybody to put in place as a temporary amendment to your employee handbooks or personnel documents. The other handout that you're going to get emailed, in addition to the slides that we're going to go through, is a sample temporary work from home policy. Again, another policy that if you don't already have in place should be included in your employee handbooks, at least on a temporary basis, as we're working on working as remotely as possible. Once we get through the nuts and bolts, I do want to look at how all of this plays in 3 scenarios. I think these 3 scenarios encapture where we all are. They're kind of different, but from what we've found over the last 2 weeks or so, pretty much every organization falls into one of 3 categories. The first one is the most bleak, and those are businesses who have either been shut down by government order or effectively shut down because there is a significant decrease in demand, clients to serve, or products to sell. In that scenario, we're having to look at layoffs and furloughs and other ways that we can control our costs and help weather the storm as we get through this pandemic situation. The second category is one in which we find a lot of us find ourselves, including my own law firm, and that's an office that has to very quickly adjust to working remotely. My office, for example, has never really done that in the past in any formal way, and we have had to change that in order to keep our doors open, do it in compliance with the government's orders, and do it in a way that keeps all of our staff safe. That presents a lot of challenges, not just on how you manage a newly remote workforce, but also we have to keep in mind how these new leave laws and other leave laws that remain in place impact remote workers and the challenges that they're dealing with. The final category of organizations in which you may find yourself is those businesses that do have work, in fact, may have quite a bit of work given what they do and how they serve the community, but are finding it challenging to have employees there to do the work. We're going to look at how we address that challenge of getting people to work to provide the services that need to be provided if they, for example, need to take advantage of these new leave laws or have other health or safety concerns that may limit their ability to do what it is that needs to get done. As we go through all of these scenarios, please do type in your questions. Suzi is going to be monitoring those and will interrupt me if she sees something that she thinks may be helpful for the group or to keep me focused or to keep me moving along. So please ask the questions that you want, ask those that are relating to what we're talking about, and also ask those that you would like us to consider talking about going into the future as we look forward to all the other issues that we're going to want to keep talking about as we move through, again, this quite historic time. All right. So again, last week, the federal government passed the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. We're all going to be referring to it as the FFCRA. It goes into effect today. So if you haven't done so already, it's time to get notice out to your employees that this is a new leave right they have available to them. And again, try to implement those temporary policies, some sample language of which we're going to send out. The guts of the FFCRA is it expands FEMLA, the Family Leave Act, to include protected leave for employees who need to be home to take care of their children because their schools or daycares are closed. That leave is paid up to a certain extent. The cost to the employer is going to be reimbursable through discounts to employment taxes. So although there is going to be some cost, in theory, the government is going to be reimbursing us all for the cost of employees taking qualified family leave. In addition to the family leave for folks who need to be home to care for their kids, the FFCRA also includes 2 weeks of paid sick leave for certain qualifying circumstances that we're going to go through. That leave is also paid, and like the family leave, is subject to dollar-for-dollar reimbursement through a tax program. There is an exception to the FFCRA for private employers who have less than 50 employees. I wanted to highlight this because we're finally getting some guidance on exactly how one goes about trying to declare themselves a small employer who would qualify for the exemption. Importantly here, this is going to be a determination that we have to make for ourselves now that won't be challenged until later on. So we don't have the ability to go to the government or go to someone to say, do I apply for this exemption? Instead, you have to do your best to make a determination of whether the exemption would apply and be prepared to defend that explanation down the road if it's ever challenged, either by the government or by one of your employees who thinks they should have been provided leave that was ultimately denied. Because of that dynamic, I do suggest that you work with an attorney if you'd like to apply the small business exemption and not provide the leave to your employees. I will tell you, I'm helping some folks go through that right now. There are several companies where I am comfortable saying that the exemption will apply, but I would definitely approach this as the exception, not the rule. It is going to take a pretty extreme situation to have that triggered. The guidance that we have, if you do need to go through that analysis, is the company needs to determine if providing the leave is essentially going to be extremely detrimental to the company, almost to the extent that it could cost your ability to continue to do business. The Department of Labor has outlined 3 scenarios where they think that could be the case. The first one is if providing the paid leave, even though it ultimately will be reimbursed, is going to financially cripple the company. Essentially, you can't get the benefit from immediate discounts on your payroll taxes, and you don't have the ability to wait for refunds from the government. Then in that limited scenario, you could say that you cannot qualify for the leave or you have an exemption to it. That one is going to be very rarely used, and truly only if the company would risk bankruptcy or having to shut its doors if it needed to provide the leave. The second scenario is one that probably will be much more applicable to most of you, and that's when the leave would essentially make it so you cannot continue to operate because the people taking the leave are crucial to operations. So this is if someone who wants the leave to be home to stay with their children because the schools or daycares are closed, if the company cannot run with them away for an extended period of time, that is a scenario where the exemption may apply. The last one is where you run an operation that if you provided paid leave in this scenario, you wouldn't be able to get your workers to work. This is really geared towards more of those in the industry of providing medical care or a service where if the leave is going to be provided, the important service truly wouldn't be applicable. Again, if you want to go down that road, I do suggest that you speak to an attorney because there's a bit of a gamble. If you declare the exemption applicable now, you have to be ready to defend that decision later on. Okay, let's look at the paid sick leave, which is going to be eligible to every employee who has been with any private employer for at least 30 days prior to today. If they have been with you for at least 30 days and they are continuing to work with you today, they are eligible for up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave in one of 6 scenarios. The first scenario that we have on the slide right here is probably the most controversial, so I wanted to start with it and talk it through a bit. And that is if there is a subject federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. Now, when this first came out, there was a big question as to whether or not this applies to the general government orders to shelter in place like we have in Oregon, Washington, and are increasingly popping up around the country. What we have determined is on their alone, those orders do not trigger protections under the new paid sick leave. There's a bit of an analysis there about what is a true quarantine or local isolation order. And the best guidance that we have right now is that that is not a general reduction in what stores are open or social distancing mandates like Governor Brown has given us all in Oregon. Instead, it is something that is specific to an employee or group of employees that says for a specific reason that employee cannot be at work. Now, the government orders that are in place right now may be part of this, but on their own, they are not enough to trigger the leave solely under the language that's in place right now. The second reason that would trigger paid sick leave under the new FFCRA is if an employee is advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to a COVID-19 concern. This probably will be much more frequent because this would apply to any vulnerable individual whose medical provider has suggested that it is better for them to self-quarantine. In that scenario, if the self-quarantine prohibits the employee from being able to work by, for example, working remotely, then they would qualify for up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave under the new law. The next category is any employee who is themselves experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and seeking medical diagnosis. The CDC has the best guidance on what are symptoms of COVID-19, but the reality here is this is going to be a very subjective test. If an employee believes they have symptoms, they likely are going to qualify for paid sick leave under this provision. Unlike traditional sick leave, it's going to be very difficult for us to require medical certification. In fact, because we need all of our medical providers focused on the jobs that they are doing, we are not going to require employees to give doctors documentation supporting the symptoms that they have. Now, we do have some common sense here that if an employee clearly does not experience symptoms, we can push back. But my suggestion is that we give employees quite a bit the benefit of the doubt And if they are experiencing symptoms, we make sure that they stay home and away from the rest of your workers. Not only is this the right thing to do for the health and wellness of us all, because this is paid sick leave that's going to be reimbursed by the government, it hopefully will not have too dramatic of a cost to any of your organizations. Now you can see from the slide that leave that is qualified under any of these three reasons is subject to reimbursement on a dollar for dollar amount of the employee's pay up to a certain cap. The cap for these three is $511 per day, or $510 total if the employee takes the entire 2 weeks.
Luke?
Yeah, Susie.
I have a question here. The question is, does that sick leave require employees to first use their existing sick leave bank?
No, it does not. It's a great question. So this is a whole new category of paid sick leave. And the government's made clear that if an employee has one of these qualifying reasons, they can use this leave before having to exhaust any of their other PTO or paid sick leave that they have available under their normal policies. However, there are going to be a number of employees who, because of the cap, won't be receiving their full pay. For those employees, they may be allowed to supplement with their traditional PTO or paid sick leave, but that's a decision that you can make as an employer of whether or not you want to allow it. The Department of Labor's guidance on this falls over itself to say they are encouraging employers and employees to work together to find out the best way to keep people working during this time. So again, you have some discretion on whether or not you want to allow to supplement, but you can't force employees to first exhaust their other PTO before they go to this leave. Now, the idea that 2 weeks is going to take care of these issues is a little fanciful, and these issues likely are going to continue, and several of your employees will exhaust this new paid sick leave and still have a need for additional leave in the future. When they exhaust the 2 weeks under the FFCRA, we go back to needing to provide our employees leave for any of the protected reasons that were in place before any of these emergency laws went into effect.
One more question, if you don't mind, just one more question as it relates to number 2 on the previous slide. The question is, do mental health issues fall under number 2?
It's a great question, and it's one that has been debated by those of us who are trying to understand the law. It really comes down to what the guidance is from the health professional. And again, we're handcuffed here because we have very little access to what the health professional is saying. I am encouraging my clients to err on the side of providing the benefit to the employee. Now, it's a little different analysis than it is under most circumstances. When we're looking at just traditional family medical leave, it's easy to err on the side of the employee because there's really no negative consequence other than the cost, right? You give it to the employee, it may cost you a bit more in paid leave or in allowing time off, but the employee can't sue you because you gave them the leave, and nobody can sue you for having been too generous. Here, we do have to keep in mind that the IRS has some requirements on what's going to be reimbursable or not. And if we provide the paid leave and the IRS disagrees with the reason, then there's a chance that you may not receive the tax credit or the government reimbursement. However, that would be the extent of the problem. You do need to be mindful that employees will be able to pursue causes of action when all this is said and done if they feel like their leave rights were denied. So in weighing the two consequences, I am focusing on avoiding employee lawsuits as opposed to being too worried about IRS scrutiny as long as we have an explanation for why we did what we did. That's a very long way of getting to the ultimate answer that for mental health issues, the answer is probably no if the ultimate question is, I'm nervous, or the the conditions are triggering my anxiety. If it is, I am particularly vulnerable and my doctor has told me that I need to quarantine for my own health, then we would provide the paid sick leave. The mental health, for example, the anxiety, my anxiety about everything that's going on, or my anxiety about needing to go to work because of these concerns is preventing me from doing my job, and my doctor has indicated that I shouldn't work. We can't just stop at whether or not the paid sick leave applies. We also have to look at whether or not they'd be entitled to leave under your normal PTO or even unpaid leave under FEMLA. So it really is going to depend on the specific circumstances. But what I would say is if your employees are raising the issue, you need to talk to them, get additional information, and if nothing else, be able to explain why you have allowed the leave or why you have denied it, depending on which way you decide to go. All right, there are 3 other categories of leave that qualify under the emergency paid sick leave. The first one is caring for someone in your family who is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine order, or who has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. So essentially, not yourself, but one of the family members who is in your care needs to be home for one of those reasons. You would need to allow your employees leave under this paid leave policy to do that. Generally speaking, the same rules of what family members that apply to the normal FEMLA rules apply here, and I would suggest going about treating it pretty much the same way. The second one is the caring for the employee's child if the child's school or place of care is closed or the child's care provider is unavailable due to a public health emergency. And this one's significant. It's significant because all of our kids are at home and they can't be home alone. It's also significant because I think despite everyone's optimism, it looks like this is going to continue for quite some time. Nothing is official, and certainly don't take my word for this, but based on what the governor, what the Oregon head superintendent said 2 nights ago, it looks like everyone is preparing for schools to be closed for the remainder of this school year. Beyond that, schools are going to start trying to do what limited amount of education they can do remotely next week, which means kids are not only going to need someone to be taking care of them, but somebody who can help direct the educational opportunities that they're going to get from the school. I think this means that a lot of our working parents are going to need to at least explore whether leave under this provision is going to be workable. I also assume that a lot of working parents who know that this law was coming into effect today have been waiting until today to start asking questions about perhaps reducing the amount of time that they can work either in person or remotely, and start trying to take advantage of this benefit. Couple things. This is where the small business exemption would apply if any of those categories that we've already talked about would be applicable to your organization. So now is the time to look at whether that is something you want to explore further. The other thing is, of all of these reasons to be on paid sick leave, this one can be intermittent. So we don't need to take this in full day increments. And in fact, we have a ton of discretion as employers to work with our employees to come up with plans that would allow them to be at home, taking care of their kids part of the time and working part of the time. The other thing that is important to keep in mind is, although there's only 2 weeks of paid sick leave, this is where the additional time under the expanded family leave would play in as well. And ultimately, working parents who qualify under this provision have up to 12 weeks of time that is going to be paid at a certain level available to them. I am suggesting that anyone who has workers that fall into this category prospectively reach out and talk to them about what this actually looks like. This is so new. It's something that none of us have ever had to do before, and hopefully we'll never have to do again, that it's not going to be so much as handing out a policy and saying, if you want this leave, here's how you apply for it. This needs to be much more of an interactive dialogue, talking about what the employee's needs are, what you need out of them in order to keep operations running the way that they need, and how we can use this as a tool to help them navigate everything that they need to navigate. The final reason that would allow someone paid sick leave is kind of a catch-all, experiencing any other substantially similar conditions specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Labor. No one really knows for sure what this is going to mean, and it's one of the provisions that we're looking for further guidance as things get rolled out. Essentially, this is if a duly qualified medical professional or government official tells an employee that they can't work because of health concerns, then paid sick leave very much is something that we need to explore as either an option or a mandate. Part 2 of the emergency FFCRA rule is that expansion of the family leave protections. And again, this is providing an additional 10 weeks of paid sick time to parents who need to be at home to take care of their kids whose schools are closed. Much like with the paid sick leave, we cannot require employees to use other types of leave before accessing this family leave, but it is definitely something to keep in mind. The slide that's up here as well makes clear an important point, and that's this federal paid sick leave is in addition to, not replacing of, Oregon paid sick leave. To remind everyone, Oregon paid sick leave has different requirements, and it includes when an employee is caring for himself or a family member with a physical illness or health condition, and closure of an employee's place of business or the school or place of business where the child was attending. The thing to keep in mind here is we need to make sure our employees know that they have those benefits that were accrued and available to them before this all started, and that they will continue to accrue and have available to them going forward. It's also really important that everybody have a system set up so they can track the different types of leave, especially since the FFCRA leave is going to be subject to government reimbursement. We have to be booking this in a way that our finance people can use to get the tax benefit. I know several folks have already created new codes in their payroll service to track the new leave separate from other types of leave, and I think that's going to be crucial. I also think it's important that when you are providing your employees notice of how much leave they have available, that we go into as much detail as possible so they understand where they stand with the paid leave, where they stand with their Oregon sick leave, and where they stand with any other PTO that you may normally provide. So again, we've already talked about the expanded FEMLA. The fact sheet that I'm going to send out after this goes into the specifics, but it really does give the opportunity for parents to have protected and paid leave if they need to be home taking care of their kids. The protection has some limitations to it. As you all likely know, if someone goes out on traditional family or medical leave, it's really important that we hold their jobs. The government has recognized that this is not a normal situation, and that the jobs that may have existed on April 1st could look very different than the jobs that are around come summertime. So we've put on the slide here what the government has said may be the situations in which you do not need to return an employee to the same position. Bottom line is, if the position no longer exists because of layoffs or reductions in force or changes in how you staff your offices or your stores, then you are not obligated to create a new position for the employee. You do need to show that you took reasonable efforts to restore the employee to equivalent position, which is pretty similar to any other time you have layoffs while someone is out on protected leave. The other thing here that is required, and something that I'm going to request you do even if you are letting employees go who are not exercising any protected leave, is have in place a system by which you're going to notify employees if and when job opportunities become available. That's something that is required with traditional layoffs, and although it may not be a mandate in this situation, it is a great practice that's going to help you get ahead of a lot of potential liability issues by letting employees whose jobs may be eliminated for whatever reason know that if and when the time comes to get back to business as normal and to rehire up to pre-pandemic staffing levels, here is how you will be notified about it, either a posting on your own website, communication directly to the employee, or something else. That's going to be really helpful to meet your requirements under the paid sick leave. It's going to be really helpful to minimize the risk of any sort of discrimination claims, which I think there will be several of by people who are disappointed that they were not offered a job back and some of their former coworkers were. Really important takeaway is, as of today, everybody needs to have a Department of Labor approved posting that is posted with all of your other traditional employee notices. There's a link here that will be sent out after we're done to the actual Department of Labor posting that needs to get out there. The other thing to keep in mind is with your remote workers, we'll need to get this sent out to them. Email is great, or some other way that you can just make sure that you have educated your workforce as to these new leave rights that are in place. That this should not replace a temporary policy that talks about how the paid sick leave is going to interact with your other leaves. Again, we'll send out a sample of that for you to have as well. By now, y'all probably are aware of the order that Governor Brown issued for Oregon, which looks similar to what other states are now doing, that has moved restaurants and bars to just takeout and delivery, has closed our schools. Again, that is looking like it is going to continue for a while, although right now it is only through April 28th. And then the one that's impacting our workforces, the Stay Home, Save Lives order that closes certain non-essential businesses like gyms and bars and a certain list of companies that simply cannot operate while the order is in place. It also requires any public or any private business that can to allow and really require its employees to work remotely. This is important. I'd like to kind of highlight that this is going to be treated almost like an OSHA situation as we go forward. Employees have the ability to complain if they think they are being required to work in an unsafe environment, and the state will investigate and make a determination if there's a problem, and if they determine there is, fines or other problems could follow. What I understand the government is going to be looking for is, if you could get set up remotely, you need to be doing that or have a good explanation of why you have not. I will tell you that the cost of getting employees set up remotely is not going to be the most persuasive. It needs to focus on, can you perform your services or provide your customers what they need in a remote setup? If you make the determination that you cannot do that, I would have a officer or director of your organization who's designated as the person who has made that decision, so that person can explain the process that went through as to leading to the ultimate conclusion as to why it's not feasible or possible. If teleworking is not available, you also need to designate someone who can put in place policies for your office or your store or whatever it might be to enforce social distancing to the greatest extent possible. This is going to be very important, and we don't have a checklist of things that need to be in place, but you should use the CDC guidance to do everything you can to keep your workforce as safe as possible given the circumstances unique to your office or place of business. There's concern about what happens if one of your employees gets sick and they can argue or show that it happened at work. There's going to be a whole slew of workers' compensation claims that grapple with that issue. And the reality is, I wouldn't be shocked to see those claims being accepted, again, if an employee can show that they were made sick while they were at work. What I'm more worried about than the workers' compensation claims are the claims that an employer was reckless with what they were asking their employees to do. So although we need to be mindful of trying to keep businesses up and running and avoid the economic consequences of a complete shutdown, if we do have people working, if it can't be done remotely, we need to really go out of our way to show everything that we have done to make our places of business as safe as possible, both for the health of your employees, but also to get ahead of the slew of lawyers who I'm sure are going to be running around after this is all said and done pursuing claims. So teleworking, again, for those of you who have done it in the past, is something that you can study for quite some time to come up with best practices. Focusing just on those of us who are being thrown into this for the first time, here's the things that I would do immediately. First, you need to have a work from home guideline. We're going to provide a sample to you. There's no magic in this. It needs to be a set of expectations of what you expect from your employees and also what they expect from you, both in what you expect to see out of them to make sure that they're being productive, how you expect them to communicate, their availability. All those things need to be put down in writing. This doesn't need to be a static contract. It can be something that is fluid, but it has to really be clear what the expectations are. That both is great from the standpoint of keeping your employees feeling good and supported. It's also going to be key if and when we get to the point that we have to discipline people for their poor performance while they're working remotely. I think we're going to make that the topic of an entire panel down the road, but there are going to be, as we get further along in this, several situations where we're needing to make not layoff decisions, but termination decisions based on poor performance. And the only way that we're going to be in a position to do that safely is if there are clear expectations set up front, preferably in a written policy. There's all sorts of technology that is available, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who are going to be willing to sell that technology to you. I would investigate investing in the technology if for no other reason to show that you've put an investment in your employee safety. All right, so let's look at some of these hypotheticals that we talked about. The first one is the business is either closed by state order or effectively business has been ground to a halt because of the safety concerns. In this situation, we are really looking at layoffs and furloughs. If you are unable to do work or if you have had to close, this is not something that would trigger paid sick leave, and it is something where if there's no work for the employees to do, then we need to look at ways to control the cost of having them on your payroll. In big terms, a layoff is where you are terminating the employee and there's really no expectation that the employee is going to be able to come back. This is for those of us who truly do not know what the long-term impact of this is going to be on our business, and we're having to make decisions that really are going to have our company looking a lot different when things start to come back to normal. Furlough is not a complete separation of employment, but instead is either a reduction in hours or even extended unpaid leave, but where you're keeping your employees on payroll. Generally speaking, layoffs, because they're permanent, it's like any other termination. The employee gets their final paycheck. If they're owed PTO payout under your policy, they would need that as well. They go off your benefits program and would have to explore COBRA. A furlough, because it is by design temporary, would be a pause in any pay, but would allow the employees to stay on benefit plans. You have to work with your benefit provider to see what the cost is for that and the specifics to make it happen. But generally, that's the impact of the furlough. When you're looking at furloughs, it does make a difference if the employee is exempt or non-exempt. For non-exempt employees, you have a lot of options available to you. You can have employees work 1 day a week, 2 days a week, take entire chunks of weeks of time off, whatever makes the most sense for your organization. Exempt employees, we have to be much more careful because if they work any period of time in a given week, they need to be paid for that entire week. So if you're looking to furlough exempt employees, do it at week periods of a time. If the other option is just trying to reduce exempt employees' salary or hours, that is also possible. But something really important to keep in mind is to be an exempt employee, you have to meet a variety of factors, including being paid a salary of at least $684 per week. So if you're looking at temporarily reducing an exempt employee's salary to help get through this tough economic time, that can certainly be done. It needs to be done prospectively, but it needs to be done no less than $684 per week, or else that exempt employee is going to have to be treated as an hourly worker until you return them to their normal salary. The other thing about both furloughs and layoffs that everyone needs to keep in mind is if you have a specific employment contract with a particular employee, that contract controls. And if that contract requires you to give notice or has limitations on your ability to adjust salary, you need to make sure that we're either negotiating something new with the employee or following the terms of the contract before we make any changes. That is something that people tend to skip. So if you're looking at layoffs, furloughs, either with specific employees or great number of employees, make sure that you're pulling those contracts before you do anything else. Finally, we do have the WARN Act when we're dealing with traditional layoffs. I think most of the legal community agrees that the situation with the COVID-19 pandemic triggers the exemptions that relieves you of the WARN Act requirements, including the 60 days notice that you need to give employees before you would lay them off under traditional terms. So what we have found as we're dealing with the confusion and emotional fallout from companies having to be closed is we need to communicate with our employees. We haven't seen what the lawsuits are going to look like out of this situation because it's all so new. But what I can tell you from having tried several employment cases is employees who feel in the dark are going to be way more inclined to pursue something than those who have been communicated with. The key in communicating with employees is consistency. You need to be telling all your workers the same thing. This is particularly important for any of your organizations that have several owners or several managers. People like to comfort their employees, but you need to make sure that anybody in a position of power isn't going to individual workers saying, hey, I know this is scary, but I got your back. We're going to do A, B, and C when all this is said and done. Even if those are said casually, arguably they create contracts that are going to bind your organization. Beyond that legal risk, inconsistency amongst owners or managers to various employees is going to lead to a ton of confusion and is going to cause a ton of problems that will be avoided if you designate one person to speak on behalf of the company about these issues and you deliver the message to everyone in the same way. Kind of to along the same vein of be careful what you're promising your employees, one thing that happens in any economic downturn, but I think is especially a risk here, is that urge to say we're going to make up for this when things get back to normal. Especially when you're talking about furloughs or reductions in pay, it's easy and it feels good to say, if you help the company out now, we're going to make it up to you later. Again, that creates a contract, and I foresee several lawsuits by employees who are disappointed when what they perceived as a promise doesn't come to be. Because of that, it's really important that all of your managers know we don't have a crystal ball and we can't be making promises about what's going to happen in the future. If we do, we really are setting ourselves up for problems. Otherwise, just make sure that you're continuing to follow all of your normal practices for terminations, including getting people COBRA information and making sure they have access to unemployment. Unemployment is going to apply both for layoffs and furloughs, even if the furloughs are only a reduction. Part of the legislation that was passed last week expands unemployment benefits to a tremendous level, and employees are going to have a lot of relief there if the company does have to make the difficult decision to either end their employment, reduce their hours, or go a different furlough route. Okay, this is something that we're going to be seeing a lot effective today, and that's employees who have been working remotely, have been doing it kind of with twine and baling wire up to this point with their kids at home, and now are saying, okay, I need a better plan in place since this is going to be more permanent. So where you may have had employees who have been able to work remotely, but they're doing it with their kids running around the house, now is the time to have a conversation about what we can do to make this a more sustainable thing going forward. Some employees may say, I got it, and as long as they're performing, we can leave it at that. Other employees may say, I can't do this, I need to take time off to care for my kids. And in that scenario, you can work with them to see what the options are, but ultimately they would qualify for the paid leave, and that may be the best option for the next 12 weeks. The other thing that likely is going to happen, I think, is this is going to be a fluid process. There is going to be people who are going to try their best and realize that either it's not feasible or they need to have some sort of intermittent plan in place. And again, that's possible. And it's something that I would encourage you to have as a real interactive conversation with your employees to make sure they understand that the paid leave is an option, other support that you can give them, and try to come up with something that's workable. In the same conversation, you have to make really clear what your expectations are. I do envision a lot of situations where somebody's going to say, I got this, I can do it all, and ultimately they're not. And we're going to have to be in a position to discipline, coach, or even possibly terminate somebody whose performance is completely lacking in that scenario. It's going to be difficult given all of the protected leaves that are at play, but it's something that we're going to need to be prepared to do. And again, the best thing we can do to get ahead of that now is set those clear expectations, show that we had an interactive meeting to come up with a plan, and that we documented how the plan would be carried out so we're ready to act if it doesn't go well.
Luke, just a quick time check. We have a little bit more than 5 minutes left. I know we have a couple more scenarios to go through, but we also have a ton of questions. So I'm hoping some of the questions will be answered in these scenarios. So if we can't get to everybody's questions, like we said, we'll follow up with an additional Q&A webinar.
Absolutely, and please feel free to email me as well if there's questions that you need answered that can't get answered. Let me go through these last ones real quick, and then we'll do a few questions. So here's a challenge that we're having is we can't keep people coming to work, either because they're qualifying for protected leave or they simply are declining to come. Here's where you have to use both the carrot and the stick to keep operations running. The carrot that we have is we can provide leave when it's qualified. We are going to keep you working now and keep you working in the future. Several companies that fall into this category are also offering incentive pay, and that's something that I would encourage. I read this morning that Fred Meyer is offering what they're calling hero pay to their frontline workers who are having to work. People are giving bonuses. All of that is creative ways to encourage your employees to come to work. The stick is making sure that people have legitimate reasons not to be there. Again, we've gone through what qualifies someone for paid sick leave. Everyone knows what qualifies for traditional leave. And if someone just says, I refuse because I don't want to do the job or I think it's unsafe, we need to get the information that they have to back that up to make sure that it doesn't trigger any protections. But if it doesn't, we can certainly push back. And ultimately, it's the employee's decision if they'd like to come to work or not. And if not, that is a very appropriate termination scenario. The other thing that everyone needs to keep in mind who's in this scenario is there are a significant amount of layoffs going on right now. So an investment in recruitment seems to be solving some of the shortage problems that some of these industries are seeing. So again, we're going to be emailing out the policies that I want you to get in place. The FAQ on the new leave should answer your nuts and bolts questions, and that work from home policy is going to give you a good starting point to make sure that you have some documentation to manage your remote workforce. Suzi, do we have a couple questions that have jumped out as being particularly prevalent?
Yeah, so there's still some ambiguity around the eligibility for the emergency paid sick leave in situations where there's not enough work for employees. So employees can do maybe a reduced schedule working from home. And, previously we understood that might qualify them to receive some of that emergency paid sick leave. But then I know there's been some conflicting information from the DOL. So I think people are still unsure about whether or not those
Absolutely.
hours qualify for paid sick leave.
So this is by far the most controversial or confusing aspect of the leave. What we know for sure is that if the only reason the employee can't work is the business is closed or there's been a lack of need, then the paid sick leave is not triggered. It's not designed to make up for a reduction in work. It's made to allow for paid leave if an employee can't work. A bit of a fine distinction though, because the reasons that employees can't work, if it's related to their own health, very much may trigger some of the paid sick leave. Ultimately, it comes down to the specific circumstances of a particular employee and their position with the company. And it's going to have to be one of those scenarios that you consult with an attorney to make a judgment call on how you would like to handle it. But kind of the big picture, what we know for sure, if you are unable to operate because of the governor's order, that in and of itself does not trigger that first scenario as it looked like it may before the Department of Labor started providing some guidance here. The further guidance makes it look like it can't just be a safety order like Governor Brown has issued. It needs to be more of a quarantine order like they've talked about doing in New York. In this one county, we have such a spike in cases that we are quarantining people. If people are unable to work because of that, which would mean they couldn't work telecommutely, then they would definitely qualify for the benefits. In these quasi areas where there's definitely a reduction in need, so there's less business, which wouldn't necessarily trigger the leave, but there's people who could do the business that is there to be done, they just can't because of some health-related restriction, then paid leave may very well be an option. Again, we're looking at the balance between an employee's argument that they've been denied a leave right versus the IRS's scrutiny of whether or not they're going to provide reimbursement. And you're going to have to, in some of these close call situations, weigh those two competing factors to decide how you would like to handle it. But I know myself and just about every lawyer in the area who does employment law is ready to help people answer that question on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, so the exception then would be if an employee had to take care of their children because of the school closure and could only work a part-time schedule, then that would allow them to utilize the paid leave.
Exactly that. Or if I have a vulnerable immune system and there's work for me to do, but I can't do it because I can't get to the place where it needs to be done. I can't interact with the people I would need to interact with. That very much could qualify someone for paid sick leave as well. But again, you need to be careful about the grand sweeping. We're going to use this to supplement a slowdown. It needs to be, we have work to do, but there are employees who can't do it. and they would qualify for leave while other coworkers are getting the work done.
And that 2 weeks of emergency paid sick leave can be intermittent, like based on hours, specific number of reduced hours.
It's intermittent for the folks who are stuck at home taking care of their kids. It needs to be taken in chunks for those who have health concerns. The point being, if the health concern's there, it's there for until it's not anymore, and then you're back to work. But for taking care of your kids, it can be as intermittent as you would like. And in fact, we can go into half-hour increments if that's what we want to do with our employees.
Okay, great. So we're at 11 o'clock. I guess, can we do one more question? Quick question.
Sure.
One more quick question was, if I'm applying for the small business exemption, do I still hand out that policy to my employees?
So there's two ways to do it. You can make a determination that as a company, it absolutely will never apply, and you would want to explain to your workers why it's not applying. So you wouldn't send out the policy, but you'd send out an explanation of, we have decided that the exemption is triggered here. Another way to do it is to wait and see until you get actual requests. So if the reason for the exemption is going to be you, employee, are too crucial to operations that we simply can't give you this request, I would circulate the policy, just make clear that will evaluate specific requests to determine if the exemption applies on a case-by-case basis. Key is making sure every employee knows that they have the ability to ask for this. Okay, great. So I think that answers a good amount of our questions. And like I said, we'll follow up with some more Q&A opportunities. Thank you for everybody attending. Just a reminder, you will get an email with the recording of this webinar and the slides, as well as the 3 handouts that were referenced. And we appreciate you attending. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.